Well, maybe we'll get started, and there were a number of other people registered, but maybe they'll join us as we get going here. So my name is Kathleen. I'm with Environment Lethbridge, and this is the third, I think, of the virtual Environment Week events that we have underway this week. And we're co-hosting this session and the one this afternoon with Lethbridge Sustainable Living Association. So if you're interested in the other sessions, if you haven't found them already, you can find all the information on our website, which is environmentlethbridge.ca. Before I turn things over to Mandy to talk about companion planting, we're a relatively small group, but probably the easiest way for questions and things is to put them in the chat box, on which you can bring up. There's a button at the bottom of the video box, and that'll bring it up on the side, and I'll keep an eye on there as we go along. Yeah, so we have this session. Mandy's going to talk for about an hour, and then we have Lori and Kelti from the Urban Hens who are going to talk about that from 11 till 12. Then in a different session, we have yoga in your yard with Lethbridge Pop-Up Yoga. And then we have an afternoon session, which has three other sessions on fruit trees and gardening and soil. I'm pulling that out of my memory. And then tomorrow we have a session on solar as well for the week. So I think with that, I will turn things over to Mandy Sandbach, who many of you may know, but Mandy is a permaculture expert and a sustainability enthusiast, and the past president of Lethbridge Sustainable Living Association. So Mandy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks Kathleen. I'll just jump in and share my screen here before we get going any further. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm glad we were able to work together to bring this symposium and this sort of shifting of realities. It was a bit sad in the beginning to consider that being the busiest season and growing, that we weren't going to be able to come together in community. So I do appreciate that we were able to kind of pivot and offer the symposium online, even if we couldn't do it in person. I am not a permaculture expert. I really kind of like resist that inside of myself, but I am definitely an enthusiast. I do have a permaculture design certificate, and I'm working on my second one as we speak. But one of the greatest things I've learned through my journey of growing food and creating edible forest gardening, gardens, community gardens, food forests, working with soil, doing a ton of teaching here in the community. The part that really jazzes me the most is really coming to know the deep connections that are happening both within the soil and through the plant life and plant matter. So when Hannah and I were talking about what this symposium might look like, what I might have to offer it, the companion planting and guild building really stood out for me. It can be used as a technique, but further to that, it can be used to sort of set the tone and the paradigm and how you consider ecosystems, whether that be annual food gardens or perennial food systems. You can use these sort of techniques and ideas and information to start building relationships in the soil, like I said, and relationships above the soil in terms of what we choose to plant with one another. So recently I've been doing a 6-week series with the Nature Center here in town. And one of the classes that I did was this one that you're about to see, this companion planting and guild building, where relationships and reciprocity rule. And the reason I added the second part to the title is that it really is all about the interconnection of relationship. As soon as you start to know and understand and watch for how these relationships happen in your growing systems, and you start to see that there's this beautiful dance of give and take between the plants, between the microbiology in the soil, as well as the insects and the birds and what plants you plant, the sooner you'll start to have some comprehension about what your role is in the garden. And that when we set these ecosystems up for success that looks like not a monoculture, one type of crop sort of situation. It's how much diversity, where can we put specific combinations of plants together so that they support one another, so that they have multiple functions. Each plant is planted not just because it looks nice or it's food, but because it's building soil, because it's attracting pollinators, specific biology, because it becomes mulch makers. Each thing that we choose to plant, whether we're dealing with an annual garden or a perennial garden, becomes really powerful in terms of the success and longevity and the health of that system. When we look to nature and we look to forest systems, or we look to prairie forest systems, or we look to ocean systems, nothing grows singularly in a vacuum. It all grows in relation to everything else. And there's always going to be this natural guild building that emerges. So my hope today is not so much that you memorize the list of plants that I'm about to show you, but that you now have a different lens to go out into the world and start to look at the patterns and the relationships in our natural systems. So even if you take a walk down to the nature center and you start to see where the cottonwoods are growing and who's growing with them, where are the chokecherries, what other plants are growing in and around the chokecherries or the saskatoons, and start to watch for some of that patterning, you can in then turn take that patterning knowledge back to your landscapes and plant accordingly. So whether you're growing carrots and beets or you're growing perennial fruits, trees, and shrubs, these techniques or these ideas or this way to look at your growing ecosystem is applicable for both of those. So this PowerPoint typically takes me 2 hours. So I'm going to go through it. And with the invitation that I'm going to talk about what I think is the most important pieces of it. And I'm going to invite you to take a screenshot of some of the lists of plants if you're looking for that. If you want sort of a copy of this for future reference, I can send a link to you so you can get the information down in a better way if that works for you. Yeah, we'll just kind of see how that works. So companion planting and guild building, where relationships and reciprocity rule. All right, so the greatest example we have of companion planting and guild building comes from our Indigenous peoples, and we are on Blackfoot land here, traditional territories. And each of our Indigenous peoples had examples of these companion plantings because they understood reciprocity and connection to nature, connection to self, connection to community, how specific plants grew together. And so the Three Sisters folklore offers us the greatest teaching. This is an example of companion planting that I use in my annual gardens almost every year, depending on how much space I have. And so the Three Sisters being corn, beans, and squash, they form this mutual beneficial relationship, the symbiotic relationship between the three of them, where we have the corn stalk that grows up through the center, nice and tall and firm, and we add pole beans, which fix nitrogen and will grow like a vine and wrap themselves around the corn stalk to provide themselves with some stability. And then we have the squash that goes and fans itself out and covers the soil and keeps the moisture at the soil level where it belongs. And so we plant in such a specific way so that these three plants can support each other through their journey to being wholesome, healthy, fully grown veg. Each of these plants don't just bring one thing to the table, which is food. They bring multiple things. So they're mulch makers, they're soil makers. They invite beneficial insects. They fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere and into the soil where the plants actually need to use it. Corn is a very heavy feeder and it requires that. So the bean brings that to the corn. And the success of it as a unit, the other thing that's really fantastic about the Three Sisters approach is that it becomes a whole food. A lot of people don't realize what a superfood squash is, but they were long-keeping, long-storage crops, so they work together, and their success is dependent upon each other. When you remove one of those companions, the other two don't do as well. They work better as a collective. And I'm hoping as I go along and I start talking about this, you're going to hear the mirrored examples and metaphors that relate to our human civilization as well. I think given the circumstances of the last couple of weeks and the riots and the protests that are going on, for me, when I consider my relationship with soil and the relationship in the plant communities, when we take our cues from them, we can definitely start to heal our own people. And so this becomes a model for all of our growing journeys, like I just said. So what works well together? Who supports who? Where is this overlapping function? How else can you get to know the plants that you're planting and what they have to offer? And we're going to talk about some characters that you can add to any garden system that are going to support you in that. So this Three Sisters way of, or approach of growing is a really good example of what we would call a guild. And so I will use companion planting and guild building kind of interchangeably. All right, so here's just another sort of infographic that talks about the Three Sisters companion planting. If you're interested, there's lots of information online in terms of how to set them up and when to plant and things like that. So what is a guild? I love the term guild. Guild to me is community. Guild is coming together with all of our own unique traits and abilities and skills in a very efficient way to support one another so that we are all better off. So according to the Webster's Dictionary, it's an association of people with similar interests or pursuits, or a group of organisms that use the same ecological resources in a similar way. And so it's this bringing together, again, of a community that can work and support one another. So in the same way that the Three Sisters are working together to share their specific skills and abilities, guilds are when we plant intentionally with mindfulness and thought, different guilds and components, these little fractals throughout our garden spaces. And this doesn't have to just be a perennial system like a food forest, which is the example you see here on the left-hand side of the screen, but it can be done in our annual gardens. And I'll give you some very specific examples as we come up here in the next little bit. So what we want to do is we're looking to nature. So food forestry is based solely on this guild building principle, where we are harvesting water and building soil and attracting beneficial insects. We're planting to fix nitrogen, and we're planting to hold the soil together and prevent erosion. And so we're doing that by specifically adding components to these guilds that have multiple functions, like I've talked about. So some examples that are commonly found in these guilds are yarrow, wild strawberry, blackberries, choke cherries, wild currants. Start looking in nature. Again, go find a chokecherry tree down in the river bottom where it's untouched and see what else is growing around it. And you will see the same plants or the same plant families starting to surround those chokecherries or those saskatoons to grow longer and stronger. This infographic that you see here on the left-hand side comes from a book called Gaia's Garden. Hands down, one of the best, most comprehensive, easy to use, home scale or large scale permaculture books. It was written by Toby Hemingway. In this permaculture guild example is something that you see replicated in food forestry and in these more sustainable and regenerative garden systems that we want to start growing. And so one of the things I want to bring your attention to here is the different functions that each of these plants are serving. So we have pollinator-friendly plants in every guild that we build. We have human attractants, which is the food, the berries. We have what are called dynamic accumulators, which are plants that reach really far down and are able to mine nutrients to the top of the soil and make them available to your plants so that they do better and they're healthier. We have nitrogen fixers in every guild example, pest repellents or insect attractors, depending on whether or not we're inviting beneficial insects or we're detracting things like flea beetles that we don't want. We have root veggies or plants that we will put into the guilds, and in order to inhibit grass. Ground covers are another example, and then we usually have a larger tree or an overstory one. And you can start to mix and match. You can plant a perennial system with annuals actually in these guilds. They become self-sufficient and they start to work on their own. Now, the other thing I think is important to understand when you're talking about companion planting and guild building is this notion of reciprocity. And so reciprocity is this quality or state of being that's reciprocal. There's a give and a take. There's a mutual dependence. One of the things I think is missing from our human systems is the fact that I need my neighbor, or the recognition that I need my neighbor. And this I can just go to the store and get what I want. I don't have to rely upon. But in the healthiest, most long-standing systems, what we find is this mutual dependence is absolutely essential. And I do well if you do well. And then we keep that abundance and flow. And I think it's important to start looking at our gardens that way as well. So what I'd like you to pay attention to in terms of this particular slide is that there's some information here. If you haven't seen Dr. Simard's How Trees Communicate with One Another TED Talk, absolutely worth your time. She's been doing a ton of research in terms of how trees communicate. And this is a prime example, the symbiotic relationship between the fungi in the soil and the forest floor in these trees and how they share information to keep themselves safe and healthy. This is kind of what we're aiming for in our fake systems, which are our annual food gardens. We want to add as many of these layers of support and mutuality as we possibly can. So again, the question is, why would I fertilize and spend money to put potentially a chemical into my system when I could just plant specific plants that give me food and medicine, attract pollinators, build soil, and on and on and on. It makes sense to be able to do that. All right, so companion planting. It's the planting of different crops within a close proximity to one another, so in the same sort of area, and it is for a variety of different reasons. So again, you'll probably hear me harp on this quite a bit, but pest control is one of the biggest reasons that we companion plant, because there are certain herbs that are really stinky and powerful, and certain flowers that will detract or invite specific pollinator friends, beneficial insects that we want in our garden space, and will kind of shy away the other ones that we don't want. And so companion planting is just an intelligent planting of a polyculture, not just rows of carrot, 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 because when you do that, you leave your plants susceptible to pests in both the soil as well as above the soil as well. And so we start to use the companion planting as a strategy and putting in different cover crops, different flowers, different herbs to start supporting that. Your tomatoes are just super wimpy. They need a lot of feeding. They need a lot of help. They need a lot of support. They're susceptible to disease and a variety of diseases that are found in other plants that we typically plant around them. And so, I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of money at the greenhouse in the springtime, and I want to support that resource. And so if it means I buy a few extra flowers and plant a few extra herbs so that my tomatoes are sort of covered and supported, it just makes sense to me. So the picture that you see on the left-hand side, you can see some red heads on the top of that. That is a red crimson clover. That's an example of a cover crop that we would use. There's kind of the larger, wider leaves there. They are buckwheat. You can see there's like some white flowers on the top of them. Buckwheat is an incredible cover crop. It invites the beneficial hoverfly that can eat aphids like nobody's business. And those are things that we want to invite into our garden spaces. So this companion situation that you see here, we have chives, we have clover, we have buckwheat, we have something that maybe that's horseradish. I'm not actually sure what's in the back. Maybe it's Swiss chard. But this is what a companion plant would look like. It's a little bit more jungly. It's not that straight, linear, clean cut garden look that lots of people tend to go for. My grandma would have planted that way. What I'm talking about is a little bit messier, so you have to be okay with like this more jungly look. On the right hand side here we have some basil. I think this is tobacco next to the marigold. We have a marigold, and then what you can see at the bottom of the screen is actually field bindweed, which is a horrible, it's the one arch nemesis of weeds for me in my world, but it's an excellent ground cover, and so it has formed because I've left that space open instead of planting with something like buckwheat or clover. But this is a typical example of what companion planting would look like. So you can go online. There are hundreds of companion planting charts. This is just one that fit neatly on this page that I'm showing you. Every companion planting chart is going to be slightly different. What I do is I find one that I really like and I print it off. I put it in a plastic sheet and I take it out to the garden with me, because inevitably you're not going to memorize any of these things. I've been doing this a long time and I don't remember them from year to year. I just give myself permission to have the reference sheet and work from there. West Coast Seeds has an excellent online companion planting. West Coast Seeds and Deep Green Permaculture has an online one that you can scroll through. It's much more comprehensive. So Deep Green Permaculture and West Coast Seeds would be two examples of companion plant charts that I would use. Here's another example. I like this picture because it showed the tomatoes and it shows these lines of a variety of different veg and flower and herbs all in one space. So this would be a typical example of what my garden space would look like. alliums, chives, onions, garlic, things like that are an incredible soil mitigator. They help with disease in the soil. And so you will find that in every one of my garden rows in some way. The other thing is that they're excellent pollinator-friendly flowers as we allow them to start to flower. So you will find them. Yeah, so this is kind of what it would look like. So here's a chart that kind of gives you some basics on examples of companion planting within your annual garden beds. So a lot more of what I do in terms of my approach working towards regenerative systems that function on their own, that are long-term, that help to serve 7 generations beyond me, are more perennial systems. So I'm moving away from my reliance upon annual gardens, not that I don't have them, because I absolutely have them, but I'm incorporating them in with my perennial systems. So I'm going to distinguish between perennial system guilds and annual system guilds, and then they overlap completely. Again, you can see the tomato here with the nasturtiums, and there's onions, the marigolds and the onions. There's probably some nasturtiums in around there, and I guarantee there's marjoram, basil, a bunch of herbs in and around that as well. So this would be an interesting page to just sort of take a quick snapshot. So when you're planting your squash, you understand that beans, marigolds, nasturtiums, sunflowers, corn are all things that work well with that particular guild. So when I think about my tomato plant, I don't think about it on its own anymore. I know that basil, beans, marigolds, onions, sage, marjoram, thyme, rosemary, that all of those things get planted together in some fashion, whether it's a row of each or whether it's in a circular pattern. This is what it looks like. So is there any questions before I go on? Are we good?
There's nothing in the chat box at this point, so I think you can carry on. If people do have questions, please stick them in the chat.
All right, so I'm going to go through kind of functionality. So when you're deciding, okay, what do I need? What is the function I want to get out of these plants to support my tomato, my squash? And I will break them down here into the actual functions, like what we're looking for. We need nitrogen fixers. Nitrogen is one of the biggest the biggest soil amendments or fertilizers that's sprayed and required for plants. But the irony of that is certain plants fix nitrogen naturally. And what we've gotten away from in our clean and our conventional way of farming is allowing these more wild plants, some might call them weeds, to actually enter into our food systems. We've sanitized the systems from that. And in doing so, we've taken away a lot of the things that were serving and feeding those plants, nitrogen fixers being one of them. So plants that fix nitrogen will have these nodules that you see at the top of the page on the base of them. So things like clover. Clover is something that gets planted in all of my systems, period, ever and forever, because it's such a good nitrogen fixer. It's such a good ground cover. It's such an amazing soil builder. Yes, the root systems can start to take over, but we plant specific kinds of clover that aren't as invasive, or we start to plant annual self-seeders instead of a perennial one. So things like hairy vetch, winter field peas, or your regular garden peas. So peas and beans, bush beans, pole beans, garden peas, get planted in my annual systems everywhere in every bed because they're fixing nitrogen as they grow. They're a cheap ground cover as well. Fava beans, something called a sea buckthorn or a sea berry. It's the cousin of the buffalo berry that we see in the river bottom here as a native species here. Sea buckthorn was developed in Russia, so it does really well in a northern climate. Sea buckthorn would be something that I would plant in my yard space to feed my food forest system, my perennial systems. You're not going to plant a sea buckthorn in your garden beds. I totally understand that. But if you have one planted nearby, the roots of that tree, as we start to prune it and work with it, will actually drop nitrogen and feed everything that's around it. So in your annual gardens, the examples are bush beans, pole beans, garden peas, and different types of clover. We want to incorporate those. Soil, usually when I do this presentation, we've already had a couple hours to talk about soil and the importance of growing biologically rich and active soil with lots of carbon matter in it. And one of the things that's missing from our prairie soils is a great deal of carbon matter. And so in our annual garden beds and in our perennial beds, we want to really make sure that we are growing and covering our soil with mulch. So whether that's a living crop like bush beans or clover or buckwheat, or that's a dead carbon source like straw or shredded leaves or wood chips, we need to make sure that we're adding that into our systems. So the examples I have here are living plants that we can grow in our yards, that we can chop down and lay their leaves at the base of whatever plants it is that we're growing. So things like buckwheat, I showed you with the little white flower, that's something that gets planted in my annual garden quite regularly. Things like fall rye, oats, and barley, they're more of a cover crop that you would grow in the fall through the winter time and then chop down in the spring. Something like comfrey is an incredible mulch making source, and it's a dynamic accumulator, so it's bringing nutrients up to feed your soils. So the plant that you see here is a comfrey plant. You want to put comfrey in a place that it stays. You don't want to be digging it up, because every little bit of root will grow a new plant. But the beauty of comfrey is that you can chop it off at the soil 3 or 4 times a season, use those leaves and lay them around your most precious plants, and they will decompose, break down, and send that nutrient back to the soil. So that the organisms can make it available for your plant. Rhubarb is another really standalone mulch maker. And so chopping off those leaves, breaking them up, putting them at the base of the soil. Things like horseradish have a lot of that, that leafy matter. Again, clover, things like borage, that's another example. So in my annual gardens, borage, buckwheat, comfrey, clover would all be things that I would be growing, so I can chop them down and support my plants. So these are this is a list of companion plants that we would use for these specific functions. So one of the biggest functions that we want served in our garden spaces is pest and weed control, and to invite beneficial insects to the system so that we can have healthy plants and healthy pollination and a complete pest control. So here's another sort of comprehensive list of, let me just see, I gotta move the screen, of plants that we can companion plant with. So I would plant things like bee balm, garden sage, yarrow, any of the mints. Mints are a little invasive, so we want to plant those mindfully. But planting things like anise and dill and borage, those can all go into my annual food gardens as a pest and a weed control plant, as a companion. You can start to see there's going to be some overlapping on function. Things like clover work in all of these categories. So rather than having, 15 different things you need to plant or know about, maybe clover is actually what you're going to choose to use. A lot of your herbs, all of your really smelly herbs, so whether it's basil or marjoram or rosemary or thyme or sage, planting those extra herbs in your garden spaces in amongst these plants will create this sense of smell around the plants that will confuse pests. So that is a great strategy. So even though I only list a few of them here, one of the things that you can do is just plan on planting a bunch of those in there. And then you'll start to get to know which ones you can dry and use for teas and medicines and salves, and then it sort of goes from there. Lots of people, when I first start having this conversation with them, talk about the fact that they don't know what to do with all the herbs because they don't cook with them. But there's lots of other ways that you can utilize that to justify the cost or the time to grow those herbs, or start to form community where maybe you don't eat basil or you don't really like it, or you're not sure what to do with it. You can start finding recipes, or you can trade with other people for these things so that they don't go to waste. It really should be functional. Dynamic accumulators, I've referred to this a couple of times. These are just really long nutrient mining plants. And I would say that things like your horseradish would fall in this category as well. Your dandelions would fall into this category. But I've listed a few that I would put in the terms of a food forest or an edible forest gardening, or typical ones you would see. So burdock, strawberry, lamb's ear, comfrey, things like that are ones that mine nutrients. But simply put, dandelions are one of the best dynamic accumulators we have, and typically they're the first ones that we annihilate. So if you can just grow a tolerance to allow a few of those dandelion roots to stay in your garden, chop their leaves off at the surface, allow those leaves to decompose, you're now feeding the soil, giving it minerals, allowing that taproot to stay and continue mining nutrients to the top of the soil for your plants. All dandelions get to live in my yard. Okay, so other functions in relationship. So when we look at water retention, which is one of the hugest issues here in Southern Alberta, we have to really be mindful of protecting our soil and our plants and keeping the moisture where it lands. We have so little precipitation, and the majority of the precipitation comes in June. And so that's not very helpful for really hot July and August. So we want to be planting things that are going to help us maintain the moisture that does land in the form of moisture out of the air, and then also as we're watering. So things like clover, your bush beans, strawberries grow really close to the ground, violets grow really close to the ground. They keep the moisture at the ground using strategies like mulching with straw, shredded leaves. If it's a perennial system, you could use wood chips, things like that. Those are multifunctional plants that you see here listed. The barrier creating plants as well. So if you want to create a bit of a barrier from one side to the other, or maybe your neighbor sprays and you need to create some sort of a bush barrier so that the spray doesn't land on your tender annuals, you could plant things like comfrey and gooseberry, Jerusalem artichoke, or the sunchokes. Jerusalem artichoke is a fantastic soil builder, decompactor, and perennial tuber. Just like a potato, you can be eating all year round, and through the winter and into the springtime, they're a really great plant to work with. So that serves multiple functions just with that plant alone. We want ground covers, and the ground covers overlap with keeping water in the ground, growing soil, growing habitat. So things like clover, strawberry, violets, creeping thyme grows really well here because it's so hot, and that is a really great ground cover as well. Things like oregano, again, mint. If you're comfortable with mint, just moving in. One of the great companions actually is mint and strawberries because they will fight it out. The strawberries that send runners, and the mint, if you put them in the same like garden bed or raised garden bed, they will find some happy medium where they will kind of keep each other back. So one won't take over the other necessarily, but if you just put mint in there, mint would take over probably everything, as would strawberries. So you can use it in a mindful way, in a companion way, to keep things from taking over other areas. So food, every plant that we've named is food of some sort, and definitely medicine. We haven't covered medicines here either, but most of what you've seen for lists of plants are very medicinal and helpful for our health. So another reason we want to be growing, like another relationship function, would be shelter and habitat creators. So these are creating habitat for our birds, for our pollinators, for our beneficial insects that we want there. Comfrey, rhubarb, apple, goldenrod, lupin, which is also a nitrogen fixer, sage, yarrow. So you can start to see the overlap. So if you can plant a yarrow and a comfrey plant within your annual food garden, you can start to cover almost all of those bases just by using those two plants. And they provide really great cut flower opportunities, as you can see here on the left-hand side. One of the most beautiful and unsuspecting things I've discovered about my gardening journey is that as I grow, I can cut snippets of some of these things and bring them into my kitchen, my bathroom, my hallway, wherever, and bring a little bit of life and color into it. So we haven't talked about that as a function, but it's a great function. Oops. So when we talk about our annual food gardens and we talk about companion planting, the very first list that I gave you with some examples of like squash and tomatoes and cucumbers, things like that, it's really self-explanatory when you look at a companion planting chart. So as long as you're familiar with a couple of charts and you can refer back to them, that's all you need to know. You don't need to memorize them. You just need to know where the resource is to go. I want you to start looking at your growing space, your ecosystem that you're creating as a whole one, as one where you're inviting beneficial insects and you're detracting ones that don't bring any value, and that you're growing soil constantly, that you're keeping as much water in the ground as you possibly can. I want you to start looking at it as a whole system. Whether that's just like one single garden box with veggies, or whether that's perennial systems in a food forest style. So before I jump into food forestry and edible forest gardening as examples of companion planting and guild building, I want you to feel comfortable with that this is overlapping. So there are certain flowers like marigolds and nasturtiums that get freely planted within my annual food system. All of the herbs that I've mentioned a number of times here tonight, they get planted freely within those systems. The alliums, the onions and the garlic and the chives, they get planted freely within my annual garden systems, as well as nitrogen fixers. So my peas and my bush beans, if I have a space to fill, bush beans will go in there because they fix nitrogen, they cover the soil, they build soil, they invite beneficial insects, and on and on and on. And so in terms of your annual gardens, what you really just need to understand is that how can you plunk those things in a regular way to feed and create this beautiful, mutual, beneficial relationships within the soil. So the example of this for perennial systems is a food forest, what we would call an edible forest gardening. And so the pictures that you see here on the left-hand side with Bobby watering is the beginning part of what a food forest would look like. You can see the shrubs. I think these are gooseberries and josta berries. There's some bee balm going in. There was some ostrich ferns, which died right away because it's too hot here. And you can see the horseshoe shape. And then the middle picture, this is actually an apple tree guild. So there's comfrey and hostas and chives, and there's 3 different kinds of currants in this particular guild. And so you can see that we've created this community within this, 10-foot radius for this apple tree to be nursed and supported till its full fruition. And we do that by using these plants. They're working both under the soil as well as above it. And then on the far right-hand side, this is a picture, I think, from 2 seasons ago at the Edible Forest Gardening, Lethbridge's only public edible forest garden, at École Vérandrie on 6th Avenue and Mayor McGrath Drive South here in Lethbridge. I invite you to pop your head in and have a look at it. It's in full force of growing right now. And this is kind of what the long-term food forest would look like, is as these larger trees are growing, these different herbaceous and shrub layers are supporting it. And then you can see the ground cover here with the clover, all of the green covering these guilds, so the soil is not left bare. So each guild, each grouping, each 5 to 10 foot square area has probably at least 20 different varieties of diverse plants serving multiple functions within each one. This is a regenerative system. This is a system I don't have to water. I don't have to weed. Very, very little do I have to. It produces mass amounts of food in a multiple of layers. So we can do that with our annual gardens as well as our perennial gardens if we embrace companion planting. So what are we doing for time here? Oh, we're good. Wow. I hope I'm not talking too fast.
Mandy, there was a question.
Yeah.
Going back to the information about the weed control plants, Stephen wanted to know which one was the most effective.
So, okay, how do I answer this? So the most effective for weed control is something that germinates fast, something that grows in thick, and something that has a companion for itself. So what I use typically in my food forest design, for example, or even on the edges of my annual gardens, so between the place where a sidewalk would be and the edge of your garden, your in-ground garden, is where the most amount of weeds will grow, because that is the edge of the system. So in those types of areas, I grow a variety of red crimson and white Dutch clover, if you can get your hands on it. If not, just whatever white or red form, or even the purple clover you get your hands on. I would use clover and I would use buckwheat. They're both inexpensive and easy and accessible. The yarrow has to get established before it becomes a weed suppressor, and the echinacea, the goldenrod, and the borage. Borage grows relatively quickly. That could be another one, but most people don't want humongous layers. So the clover and the, buckwheat's a little bit taller, but it's got a little stem and it grows in within just a couple of days. So it will grow faster than your weeds will in the spring. So I will overseed buckwheat and clover in the areas that I want coverage for. And then you're going to assess it and see how it grows. Did it germinate properly? Did it grow in? Has it established? And then watch it the next season. So red crimson clover is a biannual annual self-seeder, which means that it drops seeds to produce again next year. Sometimes that works in this climate and sometimes it doesn't. So when you use the blend, the white Dutch is a perennial. It should last about 5 years where you plant it, assuming it establishes properly. But I use a blend of them. So then in the next spring, I reseed either more clover or more buckwheat. And the idea is that I'm growing a thicker and thicker carpet to outcompete the weeds. Some of the weeds are really excellent ground covers, and you're better off to just leave them if you can't seed them right away as well. So those would be my picks. This list that you see here is probably geared a little more towards pests than it is weeds, but all of the clovers, the buckwheat, if you have an area that you're going to leave fallow for a year, so if you have open soil, you just want to get it covered because you have lots of weeds, I would plant something like vetch, hairy vetch with some form of clover and some form of buckwheat all together and have them established. The vetch will be longer standing and it will grow in thicker. It's a little tanglier to get out of your garden space, so I wouldn't necessarily put it in my annual bed for just 1 year. I would put it in an area that I know I want to outcompete weeds for a long time. Does that answer your question? I can't see the comments, so I'm assuming that answers your question. If it doesn't, you can ask again and clarify. So this slide is just sort of covering food forestry. So we talked about layers. So whether it's in your annual gardens or it's in your perennial systems, you can look at this on a micro level in your annual gardens. Do I have a root crop? Do I have a ground cover? Do I have a taller herbaceous layer that's going to fill out and close the space like a bush bean would do? You're not planting trees within that, but your tomatoes are going to grow really tall. So if you consider your tomatoes your sort of overstory and then grow down from there to support it, the philosophy works the same. But your foundation of edible forest gardening is always that you start with companions. Who plays well together? Just a sec here, I have to move my... There, I can read it now. And so, there we go. All right, so this way of thinking, this 7-layered sort of food forest thinking, is a long-term food system planning. So I'm not just planning this food system for me, I'm planning it for 7 generations down the road. And what we know about sustainability, and further to that, regenerative systems, the systems that we seem to be missing right now, is that those are systems that are going to keep the future generations in food. And so there's this comment of like, when's the best time to plant a tree? And the answer is 20 years ago, because now, you know, we would be getting the benefits of that. And so my mindset more and more as I start to really settle into relationships and the companion planting and the importance of that is adding a little bit of perennial system to everything that I'm doing, even if it's in a garden box. Is there a way I can put chives in there? And then they just come back year after year. I don't have to worry about them. One of the things you'll discover when you start actually adding these different companions, these flowers, these herbs, these ground covers, these mulch makers into your system, is that they will start to be more self-sufficient. You aren't going to be attached to your watering the same way you would be if you just left space and open soil in these like carrot, 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 beet, beet, beet kind of way of growing. You will water less, you will definitely not need to fertilize, and you will be able to keep healthy, biologically rich soils by doing that. They will be self-propelled, they will start dealing with their own system as you layer and connect and create those companions in there. So here's a list of resources that I think are applicable to the conversation around companion planting and guild building. Growveg.com I get lots of really great sort of videos and advice from there. Jordan Osman of Happen Films is incredible. If you haven't seen any of the Happen Films independent documentaries, you must. They talk about permaculture and they focus on regenerative food systems. And these are people who are market gardeners who are growing mass quantities of annual crops. And they're interplanting these perennial systems like we're talking about. One of the fathers of permaculture, I suppose second generation, is Jeff Lawton. His work with Greening the Desert will show you and make you an absolute believer that starting to create some of these permaculture techniques into how you're growing is going to blow your socks off in terms of food production, health of your ecosystem, and what you're getting out of it, and then the least amount of work you have to do. And his work sort of paves the way for that. Here's some examples of planning charts, garden planning charts. Like you can, on the growveg.com, you can actually put in a carrot, and then it shows you the spacing, and then it gives you a list of companion plants that you can now, throw in there. And so it's really helpful. And then some of the companion planting charts online, again, West Coast Seeds, Deep Green Permaculture. We'll leave it up for just a moment longer, but that's really it. Is there any questions about what I've talked about? Any curiosities, anything you've worked with that has or hasn't worked? If you get a chance to go out for a walk, or if you want to come help weed, on Sunday morning at 9:30, and then Wednesday this week at 9:30, we're going to be at the food forest to do a little bit of weeding. It's gotten a bit out of control with the students not being there in school, and so we want to give it some help and pull that layer down and recover crop it. So if you want to donate an hour of time digging some weeds out, we'd love to have you. I think we're at the end. One of the things I do want to say is that the Lethbridge Sustainable Living Association and my own business, Soulfully Soil, we will always have a variety of different types of growing workshops happening. Like I said earlier at the beginning, we've had to pivot. This is all different. Normally we would be having a composting workshop and a variety of things going on in the community. And they're just happening online and in different ways. So you can find us on Facebook, or you can go to the webpage and we'll have the updated things. We do have an intro to permaculture coming up on Sunday and Wednesday. It's a 2-part series. If you're interested, it's by donation. You can find that on my website or the Facebook page as well. And the intro to permaculture is really going to just try and take the mystique out of what permaculture is and what it can be. And lots of what I've talked to you about today actually is covered in there. Not for content, but just permaculture sets that up to look at our systems and how can we create them in a more regenerative fashion? How can we make them more sustainable? When I say regenerative, sometimes people don't understand what that means, but more sustainable. Less work for you is what I'm getting at. So if you're interested, you can find the information online or send me a note or an email or a text message, and we can go from there.
Great, thank you, Mandy. We do have some time for some questions, so if anybody has any, either add into the chat box or to even ask in person, since we're a relatively small group, please go ahead.
Try to figure out how to get back to my screen.
I think there's at the top under view options, you should be able to stop sharing your screen. Great, well, thank you, Mandy.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm gonna stick around for the hen ones. So.
All your knowledge. We are scheduled to have Kelti and Lori talk about urban hens in Lethbridge. Starting at 11, and I think we'll try and start that on time, just in case there's a few other folks who are keen to join us for that particular presentation. Lori and Kelti, are you both presenting, or you're on mute, Lori, sorry.
I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I will share my screen, and I think I'm doing a lot of the talking, and I think Lori is here as backup info, and also a lot of knowledge about the different bylaws in different cities, which is great.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to make you the official co-host then, Kelti, and you should have control to do whatever you need.
Cool. We'll just wait a couple of minutes.
Don't run crazy.
Oh, the power.
Oh yeah. So yeah, we'll just wait until 11 before we get rolling on that. Perfect time to get a coffee for anybody who's sticking around.
Do you want to pause the recording while we wait?
Kelti and Lori from Urban Hens YQL, who are going to talk about urban hens in Lethbridge and all sorts of good information about myths and things like that, I'm sure.
Yep.
So I will turn it over to Kelti to kick things off.
Cool. This is the first time I've ever attempted to share a screen on Zoom, so give me a second. Ooh, interesting. All right. So we're going to share that one. We're going to start show. Oh, hang on. There we go. So yeah, making the case for Clucks, the Urban Hen YQL project. So just some quick background on where this all started. So prior to my presentation, Urban Hens has been brought before council several times before, but the attempts to amend the bylaw 3383, which is the one that restricts the keeping of hens and other livestock in Lethbridge, has so far been unsuccessful. I presented to City Council in September of 2018, and prior to that presentation had many different meetings with several of the councillors to start the conversation and kind of get support for the idea of an urban hen pilot project. And then we kind of went through the motions with City Council, and the process kind of stalled out, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. November of the same year, administration did a follow-up presentation to City Council with different options to move the urban hen project forward. The first option they presented was do nothing, which I think is their preferred option. Option 2 was do a survey to research interest in the community and support in the community. And then the third option was to develop a pilot program for City Council's approval. And Councillor Croson actually made this motion. At that meeting, though, a lot of discussion was had. You can go online and view the video or read the minutes. And they eventually worked their way back to doing option 2, which was do a survey. The survey was published January through March of 2019. The survey was, in my personal and professional opinion, not very well done. The survey was completed by the college's community lab, and it consisted of 3 questions, which were basically, do you want every household in Lethbridge to have urban hens, which is not what we're asking for? Do you think taxpayer dollars should be spent to administer an urban hen program, which is a ridiculous question in itself? And then the third question was, do you yourself plan on keeping urban hens? So there's a number of different problems with that result, with that survey, which we'll get into a little bit. Then in March, the results of the survey were presented to council as an item for information. They accepted it as an item for information, basically took the results, shelved them, and nothing has been done since. So today, Urban Hens YQL is an online support community for interested urban hen keepers or people wanting more information on the program. And the community is just over 200 members on Facebook, and we're reaching out a lot more into the broader community. Lori had done some incredible work in the start of the year, getting us into different events and stuff going on in the city. Of course, all of those have been canceled because there is a global pandemic going on. So it hasn't really been our year. We do have 2 members of the Urban Hens movement interested in taking the request back to City Council, and they have my support to do that, as well as Lori's, I believe. Yep. And so we're looking at a new way to kind of tackle some of the concerns that were brought up. So we're focusing a lot more on public education, which is what today is about. So this is my favorite, anytime I do a presentation, this is my favorite advertisement to bring up. It is a historical ad posted in the Washington Herald from 1918, which was the middle of the First World War. And it actually advocates for the keeping of at least 2 hens per person in every backyard in America, for basically food sustainability and access to easy food. So the key points in the advertisement are hens are easy to care for, they're cheap to feed, you can feed them from a lot of table scraps and kitchen scraps, which is great for reducing your garbage footprint. They want 2 hens per person in the household, so there's plenty of eggs for everyone, keeping in mind that 1918 was also the time where you baked a lot of your own bread and made a lot of your own food from scratch. So eggs are an important component in a lot of cooking. And they were considered an integral part of victory gardens back in World War I and World War II. So I find this point particularly poignant today, given the fragility of our global food system. And we're seeing natural disasters and global pandemics and a bunch of civil unrest that can easily impact the availability of food within our system. So it's important to kind of think along the lines of food security, which is a major component to urban hen keeping. Is it's a lot of interest in having your own food and being able to self-sustain, which is really neat. History does repeat itself, it turns out. So a little bit of background on why I got involved in urban hens. A lot of these photos are just random photos taken from the internet for interest, for the record. These are not my chickens. I do not have chickens. The reason I got involved is my business, which is Theoretically Brewing Company here in town. We went to the Fort McLeod Homestead Show and Market a couple years running, and we actually provided bar services there, which was really fun. But I was surrounded by a bunch of chicken vendors and people who were really passionate about keeping poultry and livestock. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. And I got to pick up a baby chick and I fell in love. And now I just want chickens in my backyard. And my husband and I also did a garbage survey for our house when I worked with Environment Lethbridge in late 2017. And it turns out 80% of what we throw away is actually food waste. So it could easily be reused back into chicken feed or compost. We now compost, but chicken feed would go a long way too. So garbage sustainability, reducing our footprint, reducing what we're sending to the landfill, everything kind of comes into play. And then the final key component for me is I run a microbrewery. So I actually make about 500 kilograms of high quality chicken feed every week as a byproduct to our brewing process. So we're constantly looking for ways to get rid of our spent grain as cheaply or as free as possible. So we do have a couple of farmers that come in and take it, but we would love to support the urban hen community here by offering feed for free if people need a little top up for their hens. It is high protein and high quality grain that we use in beer, so it is the top of the line stuff. Chickens absolutely go nuts for it. The few people I do know that take it for their hens, the hens start mugging them if they recognize the pail, so you may want to switch up the bucket occasionally. Once they know the food is coming, it's a treat. So yeah, that's kind of why I got involved. So I started with talking to city council and then created the online community, and it kind of grew up from there. I like to bring this photo up. Again, this is a photo from the internet. It's just a lawn. And the reason I bring it up is the way that we've curated our personal spaces, our personal properties in North America is very interesting from a socioeconomic standpoint. Lawns and finely manicured gardens are a social status symbol. And we don't use our own property anymore for food production, which is a very upper middle class thing to do, or a very high class thing to do. Back before about 1700s, any personal property would have been a food creation garden. Any personal property would have been used for household sustainability because there were no such things as supermarkets. So the lawn was actually brought over from France because the French were very at the kind of peak of their Renaissance in the 1700s, at the peak of their Enlightenment. It was brought in by President Jefferson to his home Monticello down in Virginia, and he started really the process of growing lawn in North America, and that's a really unique thing. Lawn is actually the largest crop grown in North America. I'm sure Mandy touched on this in her presentation. It is also the least useful. It is not a food crop. It's literally for aesthetic and a little bit of drainage properties as well, and water absorption, but that's about it. So it's quite useless. So transforming private property into gardening and victory gardens and sustainable property is kind of the way of the future, in my opinion. So that's what we kind of want to touch on. We see the best example of this in Baltimore. After the 2008 collapse in Baltimore, businesses dried up. There are now food deserts in Baltimore. A food desert is, and other cities in the US and in Canada, but a food desert is when there's no accessible fresh food or high quality food within a certain amount of space. And some of the food deserts in Baltimore are in excess of 10 miles. So can you imagine being someone who lives in a neighborhood in Baltimore and their local grocery store closed down, so the nearest place they can get groceries is now 10 miles away, which you're certainly not walking. It would be tough to take transit 10 miles. You're now definitely going into a place where, you know, hopefully the corner store has some fresh fruit and vegetables every once in a while. So the population of suburban and urban Baltimore responded by basically transforming spaces into urban gardens. And they have massive, massive urban garden projects. You see these throughout other cities. Chicago has them, Detroit has them. Lots of other places around the world have them as well. So they take over public land. This used to be a sports field, and they have transformed it into urban gardening, which is really, really cool. This one also has a hen coop in it, which is excellent. They keep public chickens. So volunteers take care of the chickens, and they go in and they collect the eggs every morning, and it's wonderful. So, and this provides food for the whole neighborhood. It's all free, so it works out. They kind of use the city's still operational irrigation system to irrigate everything. So they don't have to pay for anything, which is really cool. A lot of people, when they come up and chat about urban hens, they're always like, oh, our winters are too cold. Our winds are too much. Like it's not feasible to keep chickens here. We've been keeping chickens here since settlers first came into the area. There's an urban hen program up in Sherwood Park, up in St. Albert, up in Edmonton has a very successful one. So, you know, places further north than we do certainly do keep hens. Hens are not too bothered by our winters as long as the coops are well constructed. Lori keeps hens, so she knows that hens can be kept here. And so there's a lot of opportunity here for it for sure. So one of the favorite things that I love to hear is people go, no, urban hen keeping it's not feasible. And then I love to show them this picture, which is a map of Manhattan and New York. And the reason I bring up New York is urban hen keeping is legal and has been legal for the whole history of New York. It's never been outlawed there, in all boroughs of New York City. So every single place in New York, you can keep an urban hen, or several. And there's no max capacity on the hens in New York. You actually, it's a nuisance bylaw. So if you annoy your neighbors, then you can get in trouble with your hens, which is really, really neat. They are not allowed to keep roosters. Roosters are restricted because no one needs a rooster. Sorry, roosters. You're not required for egg production. And people who live in apartment buildings actually keep hens. There's patio coops and little systems for them to keep control of the hens, and so the hens don't like fall. Some of those buildings are quite tall and hens are not great flyers, so they've enclosed their patios. And so it's really interesting when people say, oh, like Lethbridge is too urban, we can't do it here. If New York City can do it with a population of 7 million people, I'm pretty sure 100,000 person Lethbridge can handle it fairly well, given that most of us live in single detached dwellings. So we hear a lot of objections to the urban hen program. The first is noise, they're loud, they smell, they transmit diseases, there's pests involved, they attract pests, and of course the predators. So we're going to handle each one of these as we go through. A lot of these are actually objections that we heard directly from City Council when I presented, so I would just like to take this opportunity to address those. So noise. So which makes more noise? The Brahmas on the left or the puppy on the right? So chickens, hens, when they cluck, their decibel range is about 60 to 80 decibels, which is about as loud as I'm talking right now. So if you can sit in your backyard and have a conversation and it doesn't bother your neighbors too much, that's about the same level of noise that a hen will make. Even in distress, that's about as loud as they get. They might squawk a little bit louder when they're freaked out about something. A barking dog is nearly double that, capping at about 122 decibels. So dogs are significantly louder than chickens will be. Most urban hen bylaws restrict the keeping of roosters, which our proposal does as well. So there's no worry about a cockerel crowing at what to me is just an ungodly hour in the morning. I'm sure farmers disagree, but I own and run a bar, so I am not an early morning person. There's no roosters in urban hen keeping, so you don't have the crowing at all hours or the aggressive behavior of roosters. So in terms of noise, it's pretty negligible. Scrapping cats that have been left outside and are having an aggressive encounter with each other, they're about the same decibel range as a dog barking, just higher pitched. So again, hens, really not a noise concern at all once you remove the roosters from the equation. Smell and poop. So there is a legitimate concern around chicken guano, which can harbor salmonella. So we do want to be careful with how we handle chicken poop. And so when you go out and check for eggs every day, because you have to every single day, it takes about 5 minutes to spot clean a coop from whatever poop was brought up the night before. And this can be done while you're checking the eggs. So a more thorough coop clean is recommended weekly. It takes about 15 minutes to go in, depending on which bedding method you're doing. And then a complete clean of the run and the coop. It takes approximately 30 minutes, depending on your size of coop and the size of the run and your accessibility. And that can be done more on a monthly schedule. In the recent chicken keeping course that I took from AFAC, they recommended a complete 100% overhaul. So like get a pressure washer in there and spray everything down really clean about twice a year. So do it in the spring and in the fall before the temperatures drop, and that can be really, really useful to keeping the coop clean and disease free. Poop can be disposed of similar to dog feces. It can be thrown in the garbage. So not that big a deal. And I mean, chickens poop a lot more, but their poops are tiny compared to dogs. So I'm not sure if anyone has a large breed dog out there. I rescue them, so those poops are huge. And then if you are composting, hen guano is really, really good for high nitrogen additive in your fertilizer. It's really, really powerful stuff. It's wonderful to plants, but your compost must reach at least 70 degrees Celsius to kill off any unwanted bacteria or parasites in the compost, so it doesn't harm your fruits and veggies, and then by extension you down the line. So most home compost piles don't actually get hot enough to compost hen poop, but if you're composting correctly or if you have a different method, it can be done. Most urban hen keepers just throw the poop out though. Bird flu and other diseases, not actually a thing. Chickens have fewer communicable diseases to humans than cats do. So we're allowed cats. There shouldn't be anyone who, you know, you can get a lot more different diseases and infections and kind of that kind of thing from cats than you can from hens. The biggest worry with chickens is salmonella, which exists on the outer shells of the eggs. And that's just a matter of making sure that the eggs are clean and then maybe washing them extra carefully before use. Having a program for urban hen keeping is actually extremely beneficial because you have to register your coop with the city and by extension with the province. You will have a coop, basically an ID for your property that tells the province like, hey, there's chicken coops in this area. That way, if there is a disease like a pigeon carries something in that could infect the birds, the province can alert all of the hen keepers and they can keep an eye out on it for outbreaks. So we would actually rather have a viable urban hen program than a bunch of people keeping hens illegally in the city, which does happen, because that way at least the province knows where the coops are located in case anything does go wrong and we have to destroy flocks. So it's actually better to have a program than have secret hen keepers. The other things that you have to watch out for with birds is mites and lice. Hen lice do not bite humans. There are certain diseases of lice, certain species of lice that are pretty specific to the animals that they like to nibble on. So hen lice is not really transmissible to humans, and then mites have no interest in humans at all. You just have to watch out for those in your coop. And you're doing that anyway because you're cleaning the coop every day. Like, you're keeping it very, very clean. So, and I love adorable children feeding chickens in an excited way. So that's why that's the picture. There we go. Pests. A lot of people are like, oh, they'll attract mice with all their feed. Hens are tiny dinosaurs. They like to eat things. In addition to seeds and insects, hens will enjoy and will eat any additional pests that might find their way in. It is very rare to find a mouse in a hen coop because the hen will eat it. I have seen hens do this with snake, mice, and other rodents like voles that might wind up in your garden. So they're little dinosaurs. They like to munch on anything. They're quite active in the garden, especially if you free range them. They will look after any bug infestation that you might have. They're wonderful for ants because they scratch down ant hills and they'll dig their way in and get all the good stuff. So it's a good protein contributor. I was gonna post a picture of a chicken eating a mouse, but it's kind of gross and didn't want to like worry anybody. So you can look it up online. There's a whole thing. And what about predators? So chickens being at quite the bottom of the food chain, they have a lot of predators that are easily found in southern Alberta. Everything from birds of prey up in the air will come and take out a chicken if they have the opportunity. Raccoons, badgers, skunks, cats, coyotes, foxes, and of course your lovely best friend, the household dog. If not trained properly, they will take chickens out. I actually had a family of skunks living under my front step. There were 9 of them this year. We baited them into traps using store-bought chicken eggs, and they love them. So not only will some of the predators go after the hens themselves, they will go after the eggs as well. So that is something to be aware of as a hen keeper. You can see the fox also has an egg in its mouth. It's adorable. That being said, the way you kind of mitigate the risk with predators is coop construction. So you just make sure that it's built really, really well. The walls of the run should be buried at least a foot deep and secured. Some people actually lay wire all the way in the bottom of the coop, like the coop is fully enclosed, and then they just bring in soil and bury the wire caging so nothing can dig its way in. And then for air predators, it's a matter of having the run fully enclosed in the top as well. Chickens are not great flyers, so you don't ever have to worry about them fluttering away too much, but it's about keeping them safe from our lovely birds of prey here. So that's the main consideration with predators as well. The other concern that was brought up at City Council was, this is actually a shot from Philadelphia. And a couple of years ago, Philadelphia started an urban hen program by saying, okay, chickens are legal. There were no bylaws written about it, just, okay, you can have a coop. With that, a lot of people got into urban hen keeping improperly. So they didn't have the right structures, they didn't have the right knowledge to keep urban hens. A lot of people got frustrated and eventually wound up bringing their chickens back to the shelter, which causes problems when the shelter is not ready for the volume of hens that were coming in. This headline itself is actually a little bit misleading, and I love bringing this up because people will be like, they're overrun with chickens, as the headline says. They went a 600% increase in the amount of chickens surrendered in a year. So from 2 to 12 is what they did. So that is a 600% increase, but they had 12 hens that they had to rehome. All of them eventually went out to a local farmer on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't actually that big a deal, but you know what the news does with headlines, and it's a lot of fun. This only happens and has, like, the research is pretty solid on it now. It only happens in cities where they do not have an urban hen program, where it's just allowed to be a free-for-all. And that's not what we're advocating for. We're actually advocating for a very strict urban hen program, similar to the one that they have in Red Deer. So we'll get into that in a minute. Common misconceptions about urban hens. Roosters are not required for egg production. I mentioned this before. One of the city councilors was under the impression that you had to have a rooster in order for the hen to lay eggs. That is not how hen biology works. Roos are not required for hen production. For egg production. They are only required when you want to incubate those eggs and create new chickens, which is not what you want to do if your goal is to eat the egg. The other myth that we see a lot is chickens are only able to lay eggs for 1 year, but will live for 7 or 8. This is incorrect. Most breeds of hen will lay solidly for 2 to 3 years, and then they will slowly decline their egg production over time. Lifespan can be a lot longer, and it will depend on the urban hen keeper and how they feel about euthanizing their hens or keeping them alive as pets after their laying career is done. They do make wonderful pets. So they're every single one of them has a personality, and they're very, very fun. And I mean, they're great gardeners. So you may just want to keep them around. And then the last myth we come into contact a lot is people will slaughter and eat their laying hens at the end of life. Most urban hen bylaws prohibit slaughter, and most laying hens do not have enough meat on them by the end of their laying careers to make it worth the slaughter. The other question we got from City Council, which was actually affirmed weirdly by city administration, was that Councillor Ryan Parker, brought up that it costs $1,000 to euthanize a hen. I recently took a course from Alberta Farm Animal Care Association, AFAC, and I asked them how much it costs to take a hen to a vet and have it euthanized, and they said it costs about $45. So $1,000 is not accurate in any kind of way. And then the other cost you might incur is cremation for your chicken. Just like you would cremate a beloved dog or cat, the vets will often look after cremation for you. That kind of end of life care and euthanasia, those methods are possible. There may be costs involved. About $45 is the cost, it seems. And a lot of vets just throw the cremation of the chicken in for free. Oh, hey, Lori's got a little chicken there. Hello. Sorry, completely distracted.
They are now.
Thanks, Lori. Yeah, so with end of life care, it costs about $45. A lot of vets will actually cremate chickens for free because they are feathers and hollow bones. Like, they do not take very much to dispose of in that kind of term. A lot of hens at the end of their laying life will die naturally, and when that happens, all you have to do is just, you know, throw it out, which sounds a bit harsh for a beloved pet, but there's not really anything you can do with it. So, you know, if you want to bury it like you bury your beloved dog in the backyard, go for it. But there are ways to responsibly dispose and euthanize of hens when they reach the end of their lives. And it does not cost $1,000, despite what city administration seems to think. When I brought that up, a lot of the vets in the program actually were like, we're going to move to Lethbridge if we can charge that much. So, yeah. Lori's got some hens there. That's awesome.
I don't know if anybody else can see though.
Well, I can see them and I can hear them, and they're adorable. Hello.
Well, these are two from our flock from chicks this year.
Oh,
so these
wonderful.
are for this year. So they're only half grown. So these are
garlic.
Yeah, these are Brahma
Nice.
chicks. We don't have Brahma in our mature flock yet, so we're having fun doing something new.
I love Brahmas. They look like they're wearing pants.
They're super fluffy.
You could have brought some dill.
Yeah.
Dill has fuzzy feet. It looks like snowshoes.
So yeah, so moving forward, our proposal to the city of Lethbridge is still to move forward with an urban hen pilot program, and we are still pursuing that with the city. We're looking to, in the pilot program, we're looking to license 30 to 50 urban hen keepers, so that's households in Lethbridge, with a maximum of 4 or 6 hens per household. Hens only, no roosters. Coop dimensions and requirements and property setbacks are a common feature in most urban bylaws. So they exist in pretty much every bylaw active in Alberta. So we would encourage that in our bylaw as well. Licensing requirements and inspections. So much like you buy a dog license, you would need to buy a coop license, and then you would be subject to inspection to make sure that coop is maintained and properly cleaned and your flock is healthy. We're also asking for a maximum of 100 households to be licensed after the pilot project concludes. So there are 37,000 dwellings in Lethbridge. There are roughly 8,000 dogs in Lethbridge, and we are asking for a maximum of 600 chickens to be allowed to exist in the city. So that is kind of the scale that we're looking at. The city of Lethbridge, in their survey back in March 2019, asked if everyone was okay with everyone having hens in Lethbridge, and that's not what we're asking for at all. So having a max cap on the number of people who can keep urban hens in the city is common. Red Deer is at 100, they cap out at 100. Edmonton just expanded their program to 125 in the city. So there are other places in the province where a cap on the number of people who can keep hens in the city limits at a time. And a lot of these programs haven't actually breached their max cap. Like, they don't have enough interest from people in the community to do it. So with licensing requirements, there will be licensing fees. So that will help pay for the administration of the program, which should be relatively low cost to the city if they properly utilize the community groups that are interested in managing this, which we're one of them. So the other stipulations are hens of laying age only. So you get pullets, which are adolescent hens, not chicks. You don't need to raise them from babies or incubate eggs. A lot of urban hen bylaws stipulate that they have to be of laying age at minimum, and then once they age out from laying, you can decide what their end of life looks like. And then some communities have neighbor veto powers. So that's when you go to city council or you go to city hall and you apply for your coop license. They send a notice to your neighbors that, hey, this person has applied for a coop license. And then your neighbors have the opportunity to veto that. We're asking for not having that because I'm not able to veto my neighbor's really loud barking dogs. So it only seems fair that we should be able to keep our hens if they're allowed to keep their dogs without any input from us. So just some of what the proposal looks like. We can get into more details and questions if you have any later. And that's it. So I guess now is the time for questions. That was about 35 minutes of me talking.
Thanks, Kelti. Yeah, if there's any questions, you're welcome to use the chat box or just take yourself off mute and ask them that way.
Awesome.
My daughter already took the chickens back, so they can't answer any questions.
No.
They were very cute. I'm excited you got Brahmas.
Invitation only, because chickens aren't allowed in the people house. So.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Well, maybe I'll interject a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's funny, most people who have a really strong opinion against hen keeping are coming from an experience of being commercial chicken keepers. And it's 100% different. It's unfortunate that these hens don't actually have a completely different type of name. Because when you talk about a chicken, most people are thinking about, the big barns that, are on industrial scale. And those are the places where you've got noise, smell, disease, pests, and too many chickens. So it's 100% different. And you're also talking about quite different breeds too. They're short-lived, they're generally unhealthy, and because they're intended for a very specific purpose that's very short-lived, the chickens that you would harvest for meat would have already been harvested by the time they're the age of the one that was visiting earlier. And so they're not mature yet even. So they're quite a different creature than what you would be raising in a home.
Yeah.
And if you think of the diversity of what a dog breed is capable of, you've got everything from, the Saint Bernard to the Chihuahua. And chicken breeds are absolutely just as variable in temperament and even longevity, and the types of diseases that they end up having, and climate suitability. So I'm always choosing breeds that are going to be happy here, being outside in our weather. And the birds that we're raising this spring probably will last 8-9 years, happy hens. And it's a completely different thing from the commercial type. So just wanted to interject that.
Yeah. So broiler hens that are raised for meat are killed off at 12 to 16 weeks. They're only about 4 months old.
Not even that. It's 5 to 6 weeks.
Wow. Okay. So a month and a bit old before they are harvested.
Yeah.
And because of the genetic breeding and modification that's been done, they get too big for their own legs to take their weight.
Yeah, and they're selected to be able to grow as quickly as possible with the
fed a diet
amount of feed. Yeah. So when you look at the graphs of where the best payoff is, it's about 5-6 weeks, and then you'll end up with a bird, a little carcass that'll fit in one of those pre-cooked chicken packages at Safeway, where the thigh bones are about that long, and there's not much to them, and they're really tender. It's because you're eating veal. So
yeah.
Okay.
Well,
go ahead, Larry.
Oh, good.
Unless anybody has any other questions, I think that's it. Oh, go ahead.
I'm just going to ask. I'm from Tabor, and it's just been in recently where there's been someone trying to get this here, and it's been voted out. Have you worked with her at all?
We're communicating with the Tabor effort. I know that she brought it to City Council within the last couple of weeks, disappointing to hear it's been voted out, not surprising. These bylaws do take a number of years to get kind of changed over and get the minds changed about things. But we are aware of Tabor's efforts, and we hope that if Lethbridge moves towards it, Tabor will as well. There is actually a bylaw going in Coaldale. Coaldale has now passed it, so I'm hoping that Coaldale will just kind of lead the way for the rest of our area, and we can get some hen keeping bylaws throughout the communities in southern Alberta. Fort Macleod does allow, as well as Okotoks and High River also allow now. So there is a movement towards more cities going back to allowing urban hen keeping. So in terms of the history of the bylaw itself, the bylaw 3383 was originally developed in 1953 when commercial operations were kind of starting to pop up in Lethbridge, and then they had problems with the noise and the smell and the disease and that kind of stuff. So bylaw 3383 came in to kind of mitigate that factor and said no livestock keeping in the city of Lethbridge. So also in 1953, we saw the rise of the first supermarkets. So urbanites were able to get reliable food sources just around the corner from their homes, which really discouraged the keeping of gardens and the keeping of hens in the city. So that's kind of where the history kind of stems from. And now we're seeing a lot more municipalities go, oh, we can keep small flocks, like small flocks are fine. So it is a growing movement across North America. Interestingly, in most places in Europe, you've been able to keep hens the whole time. Like in England, it's nationwide. You can keep hens anywhere. So, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
Of course.
Hi, thanks. Sorry, I came late to the meeting because I had a work meeting before this, but I'm just curious. So I know it's not yet, above board in Lethbridge, but I have a few friends and neighbors that I know who have a few chickens. Do you have a sense of like how many people in Lethbridge do have chickens?
Personally, I know that there are a few kind of stealthy urban hen keepers in the city. I was talking to a bylaw control officer, an animal control officer, a couple weeks ago, and he says, yeah, he's constantly chasing a rooster around the south side. Yeah, he gets a lot of calls for the same rooster. They're like nemesises now.
It's like a rooster that is like not kept within the confines of someone's yard or coop? Or...
Well, I think the idea is that the rooster stays put, but I think the rooster is a bit of an escape artist. So there is a rooster on the south side for sure. There's definitely some houses around the city that are keeping hens. I was fully prepared to illegally keep hens myself, and then realized that I have a bylaw control officer as a neighbor and a city manager as a neighbor, so it would not have worked out well for me. So that's why I'm really pursuing the more legitimate way of urban hen keeping, which is I now have to fight to change the bylaw in order to get what I want, which I'm fine with. Yeah, so sorry.
Is there a workaround by saying that your hens are, it's not a flock, but it's like a pet, like kind of exotic pet, or?
I wish there was. So hens, and Lori can speak to this a little bit better, but hens are highly social animals, so they do need a flock. You really shouldn't keep just one.
Yeah, I mean, like if you've got, I don't know, 3, and those are your 3 cats or your 3 dogs that.
Yeah, so Calgary actually does not allow urban hen keeping, but they allow hens as emotional support animals.
Okay.
Lethbridge is, I mean, you could make the case for an emotional support animal. It would need to be registered as an emotional support animal. I'm not sure that would be successful, and I'm much more interested in just like actually creating a better bylaw and a better program than, again, encouraging basically what would become a free-for-all to have urban hens.
Well, really what's happening in a lot of other places where they're they're playing with these pilot projects is that instead of actually changing the base bylaws, which are either the bylaw that you're fighting against says no livestock, or it says no poultry.
Mm-hmm.
And in the two different styles of the way the bylaws are constructed, you're going to attack them in different ways. And so when you're going about having a bylaw amendment, you're usually adding a bylaw that is sort of an exemption of what's already in place. So they're not actually taking out, you can't have livestock, but they're saying you have an exemption to the existing bylaw to do X, Y, or Z. And it's usually a pilot project that gets extended year by year. And then they have the power to just pull the rug out if they need to. And so these exemptions, there's an emotional support exemption that's in place for Calgary. So in general, there's no livestock permitted, but you can have an exemption through the city manager. Yeah. So what we would probably, practically speaking, if Lethbridge would become a little more pro just thinking about these things, especially council, they might introduce some kind of an exemption for a pilot. And that exemption would have a specific amount of time associated with it. So it'd be, you know, a 1-year pilot or 2-year pilot with a certain cap on it. That's generally what's worked well for other communities. I'm thinking of Calgary and Edmonton, and there's a long list actually. So we've got there's a lot of other bylaws that are giving us a blueprint to work from. Mm-hmm. And so the trick right now for Lethbridge is to just get the conversation going, get people a little less scared of what it is that the proposal is, and bring them on side just a little bit with opening their eyes a tiny bit, and then, you know, taking the tiny baby steps. But it probably wouldn't look like an entire bylaw overhaul. It would be an exemption to existing bylaw.
Yeah. Interestingly, in bylaw 3383, it does stipulate that all livestock is prohibited from being kept in Lethbridge. So that includes things like bees and hive pollinators. You can't keep honeybees in Lethbridge technically. But they do allow for racing pigeons. So I really do want to know who in 1953 had like a passion for racing pigeons.
Well, in the case of the pigeon, well, we have a pigeon bylaw. Yeah. And it's basically, it kind of is worded a bit like an exemption as well. Yeah. And part of that bylaw requires that you be part of the association.
There you go.
And that you have a mentorship in place. And so there again, it's the same sort of blueprint that you'd be following for a chicken exemption, would be that you have a group of people that are knowledgeable and have a plan, and that anyone participating in the project would have to, you know, follow the rules and be subject to the guidelines, or get booted out, and then you don't have your exemption anymore, and the bylaw folks can take you out.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you to both of you for all that great information, and thanks to everyone who joined us. Next on our schedule is yoga in your yard. We do have a different Zoom link for that, so if you're planning to join us for that and you haven't registered, you can find the link on our website, which is environmentlethbridge.ca. And just to let everybody know that we are doing a draw for a couple of gift cards to local businesses for Environment Week. And so everyone who attends one of our virtual workshops will be entered into that draw. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you very much and happy Environment Week. And hopefully we'll be able to see everybody in person sometime soon.
Thanks so much, guys.
Have a great day.
Thank you.